Hi, this is Tony Northrup, and for Train Signal's SSCP Video Training Certification course, I'd like to cover wireless and cellular technologies. First up, let's talk about the biggest one right now, and that's Wi-Fi. Oh boy, here's a big table filled with numbers and frequencies and history. Let's quickly go over the 802.11 protocol and everything that it's meant over the years. The first version of this, just plain old 802.11, was released in 1997. This is the very first type of wireless networking. Up until that point, if you wanted to exchange packets with something else, you needed a cable. Silly, right? Since wireless networking is so pervasive now. The theoretical bandwidth of this was 2 megabits per second. Realistically, you never even got a full megabit per second, and your range was, well, they say about 66 feet, so not much at all. And this used the 2.4 gigahertz frequency. These frequency ranges are really defined by the FCC in the United States because they regulate which frequencies are used for commercial radio broadcasts and commercial television broadcasts, and they open up a couple of frequencies for things like wireless networking or wireless home phones or whatever else you might imagine, remote control cars, and you can pretty much do whatever you want with them in the consumer space. And then the rest of the world kind of uses the same frequency because, so many of these technology companies are based in the United States and we're the biggest consumers. But there are other frequencies like the 3.7 and 5 gigahertz ranges, which in some ways offer better bandwidth and range. In 1999, the 802.11a standard came out with a much increased theoretical bandwidth of 54 megabits per second, meaning you could actually get 10, 12 megabits out of it. I have no idea why the theoretical bandwidth is so much higher than what you actually get, and I hate that they basically lie to you. They always advertise these networks as being ridiculously fast, but then when you actually try to use them, you get not half, not even a third, but some tiny fraction of the bandwidth you were promised. Anyway, it's really disappointing. It doesn't so much happen that way with wired networks or with the wireless broadband that you get on your phone. I find that I get pretty realistic bandwidth out of that, but when it comes to Wi-Fi, they're just lying to you, right? Well, 802.11a doubled the range up to about 115 feet, and because that's a radius, that means you're covering much, much more square feet. And in that same year, a competing standard came out, 802.11b. It used a different frequency, the 2.4 gigahertz frequency, and it had about the same range, but it had a much smaller realistic bandwidth, about a third to a quarter. And 802.11b just won hands down. It was like VHS versus Betamax. Like Betamax was clearly better, but VHS won. And I don't even know enough about the history to know why 802.11b won. But it was just adopted by all the different computer manufacturers. Maybe it was just cheaper to produce. Anyway, 802.11a kind of got forgotten, even though I thought it was the better protocol. 802.11a and B got to be so popular that they just rushed to get more wireless standards out to improve the bandwidth and the security of it all. And along comes 802.11g. This builds upon 802.11b, providing backwards compatibility and using the same 2.4 gigahertz frequency. So you could buy an 802.11g wireless access point and all your old 802.11b clients could still connect to it. And vice versa, if you bought a new computer that had an 802.11g radio, well, it could connect to 802.11b wireless access points that you already had. So that backwards compatibility basically blew 802.11a away. 802.11g offered pretty similar performance to what 802.11a had many years ago. It got a little more realistic bandwidth, at least in my own testing, and a slightly better range. More recently, in 2009, they released the 802.11n standard, and this provided, again, much better bandwidth and range. This time they brought back the 5 gigahertz range, and some 802.11n devices can speak 802.11a. Now, though, I don't ever see 802.11a wireless access points out here. So suddenly you could actually get over 100 megabits with your wireless network, and this was really important in the consumer space because suddenly you could stream TV and even HD TV. So we're still kind of seeing this emerge, but soon I think we'll be all connecting to a central media server in our home and watching TV throughout our house without running any wires, wherever you want to be. Could also be on your mobile devices, your tablets, your mobile phones. It's a brave new world, right? And 802.11n has been key to that. Certainly it doesn't end there though. The 802.11ac standard is basically out. They're testing actual devices now, and some new devices are actually coming with 802.11ac capability. It offers pretty close to double the amount of realistic bandwidth, though again, they just keep pumping up the theoretical bandwidth. My basis of the 260 megabits realistic bandwidth is based on device testing. So there are already some devices out that support 802.11ac, and people testing these production devices are managing to get about 260 megabits and about 300 feet of range out of it. But the theoretical bandwidth is 3.4 gigabits. So I don't know why the theoretical bandwidth is growing even faster than the realistic bandwidth. Realistically, you're only getting like 8% of the theoretical bandwidth, and that seems absurd to me. Another standard is following AC, which is 802.11ad, and again, it promises to be twice as fast. At this rate, it'll probably only be 20% faster in the real world. 802.11ad promises to take advantage of a fairly new frequency, very high frequency, 60 gigahertz. So with all that said, today most people are deploying 802.11n networks, but be keeping an eye on 802.11ac. When I'm recording this, it's still being finalized, and that means it's going to be kind of a headache. Devices aren't going to be completely compatible with each other, and if you buy a device from Linksys, it might not work with a device from another manufacturer. So you'd be well advised to buy client devices and access points from the same vendor for the time being. But if you're listening to this in the future when it has become more common, then I'm sure everything will be completely compatible and we'll just be deploying 802.11ac universally. Now I'd like to just provide some tips about improving your Wi-Fi performance. These devices require updates just like anything else. The adapters in every one of your devices, your laptops and your tablets have firmware and drivers that need to be updated on a regular basis, so keep those up to date. Your wireless access points also have firmware that should be updated not just for performance reasons, but to patch any security vulnerabilities that the manufacturer has discovered. And even when a network protocol is already widely adopted, like 802.11n is now, you can still get performance benefits by choosing your access points and adapters from a single vendor. So I try to do that. If most of my computers have Linksys network adapters in them, then I will go out and get a Linksys wireless access point. They'll work with other vendors' access points, but each vendor does most of the testing and performance tuning with their own hardware, so I find that you do see better performance. Some wireless access points and even some adapters allow you to swap out the antenna. Not all of them. Some of them have them just kind of neatly contained inside and it looks nice, but what you usually get are omnidirectional antennas built into these devices. That means that they send the frequencies out in a nice big sphere. If it's not a sphere, then it's kind of a circle radiating out left, right, front, and back, but not as much up and down. In other words, they'd be designed to cover a floor of your house, but not so much the basement or the second floor. Well, if that doesn't meet your needs, if you can't put the router in the middle of your house, but you need to put it in one corner, you can get a directional antenna, which they also call a high gain antenna. And these point all the signals in one direction. Now, of course, Wi-Fi is always a two-way conversation. It's not like listening to a radio broadcast in your car where your radio just receives a signal and never needs to talk back. Wi-Fi doesn't get you anywhere unless your host can talk back. So high-gain antennas are of dubious value, but they are very useful in specific scenarios. And if you configure both the client and the access point with directional antennas, then you can get a lot of range. You can get hundreds of feet. People will go for over a mile with Wi-Fi using directional antennas. You can get USB wireless adapters for mobile or desktop PCs and then connect a directional antenna. And you could point it out your window and share Wi-Fi with somebody halfway across the city if you wanted to. Another really important way to improve Wi-Fi performance is to increase the network adapter power. Another really practical way to get better Wi-Fi performance is to increase the power of either the access point or the network adapter. Windows allows you to tweak the wireless adapter power settings under the power saving options. And by default, when you're not plugged in, it has it set to a medium performance level. So it's actually tuning it down a little bit. So if you're having a hard time getting a signal and you're on battery, you might go in and either select the high performance battery profile or manually go tune the default power settings to up the amount of power dedicated to your wireless adapter. Of course, you'll burn through your batteries faster, but if you need a signal, then you should be able to get it by increasing the power a bit. Many wireless access points also allow you to tweak the power, and just like with your mobile device, if you increase the power, you'll get more range, you'll get more speed, but you'll use more electricity. And in some devices, they also generate more heat, which has been known to damage them. But, search the internet, check your device's manual, and make sure that it's safe to do. You can also improve wireless performance by just adding more access points. I do a lot of high-speed streaming around my house, so I actually have 3 different access points that I have a strong signal everywhere in my house and in my backyard, because I often work from the backyard. One way to do this is just to set up access points using the exact same name, but put them on slightly different channels. So I have networks called Contoso, because that's an approved fictitious name by Microsoft, who I do a lot of work for. And I have one wireless access point on channel 1, one on channel 6, and one on channel 13, I think, whichever ones are allowed in the United States. That way they don't necessarily overlap, and my wireless devices will simply automatically connect to whichever one has the strongest signal, wherever I am in the house. You also want to move your access points away from interference, so don't put them right next to a steel filing cabinet. No, put them a few feet away. In fact, move them away from walls and ceilings as much as you can, because if they're right against something, it's just going to absorb a large part of the signal. The farther you move them from any source of interference, the less signal is going to be disrupted. If you want to be able to get a wireless signal outside, pull those screens out of your windows and your sliding doors, because those screens are a nightmare for wireless performance. In fact, you'll still receive a strong signal through a screen, but you'll find you won't actually be able to browse the web. Like, it'll show 3 little bars in the Wi-Fi icon, but then you can't get anywhere. And it's because you are getting a signal, but it's getting jammed up by that screen. And if you pull those screens out, you'll be amazed how much better it gets. Finally, change your wireless channel. Now, this is kind of an outdated recommendation, because I find most modern access points automatically select the best channel. They'll scan the network and see what other access points are on different channels in the area. So if your neighbors have one, they'll pick a different channel so they don't overlap. But if yours doesn't do that automatically, then you can use a wireless scanning tool to determine what networks are out there and what channels they're on, and then simply pick the one that's the least busy. Now let's talk about wireless broadband technologies. Once again, a table filled with history. This one goes back even farther, back to the 80s, when you had these like briefcase-sized cell phones. And I'm certainly not old enough to have had one of these. I was a little kid, but this was called 1G. And the data bandwidth that you got was about 56 kilobits, and well, it was analog anyway, so it wasn't like you were connecting to the internet. It didn't exist in its current form. And there was really no security. In fact, you could buy a little receiver and just eavesdrop on people's cell phone conversations. Not that I did that, but in theory you could have. And that stuck around for about 10 years because, well, technology just moved slower at the time. But come 1991, 2G comes around. This time there is some actual encryption, and the bandwidth goes up a little bit. 2003, stuff starts to really get better. We see 3G come in, and suddenly we start to see LAN style speeds. You know, if you have 3G on your phone, you can actually browse the web. I did have one of the original iPhones that had 2G, basically, and it was painfully slow. Like, the network was barely usable at those bandwidths. You could browse the web, but you needed to require some patience, and who's got patience nowadays, right? So 3G kind of takes away that need for patience. It also provides actual security. It authenticates the network and improves the encryption. Back with 2G, you could set up a rogue cellular network, and people's phones would just connect to it and start sending you data because they didn't authenticate the network, as silly as that seems. Nowadays, there's more authentication, so it's a little harder to impersonate your wireless provider. And more recently, we've seen 4G networks, and there's no formal definition for 4G networks. It encompasses a bunch of different technologies like LTE that AT&T provides, and a handful of other technologies. And so the bandwidth isn't all the same, but they're generally much better than 3G, and they're generally quite quick. Some of them go up to a full gigabit per second, and I've seen that in the real world. Now, we're already working on 5G networks. Again, they're not going to all come out at once. It's not a single standard like Wi-Fi is. They're technologies developed by different cellular companies, different mobile device companies, and they're going to be released whenever they're released. So they'll come out at different times. Some of them will be faster than others, but we kind of group them all together and call them 5G, but know that that's a completely made-up name, just like 3G and 4G. Now I'd like to talk about a couple of different short-range wireless technologies. Up first is the ubiquitous Bluetooth. Bluetooth is terribly useful because it allows devices to automatically connect to each other when they're within a few feet of each other, and not do any major data transfer, but do lots of useful things like transfer your music and your keyboard and your mouse settings. Bluetooth, like Wi-Fi, uses 2.4 gigahertz, and it provides bandwidth up to about 3 megabits per second, though Bluetooth has gone through a couple of different versions, and they each had different capabilities. I use Bluetooth for lots of different things. I have a Bluetooth mouse that I use when I travel, and I have a Bluetooth keyboard for my iPad that makes it easier when I'm typing an email or trying to write a document. I have Bluetooth headphones that can connect to my iPhone, so I don't have to have a cord shaking around when I'm jogging. And when I get into my car, my phone automatically connects to my car via Bluetooth, so I can receive calls and play music. Anyway, Bluetooth is terribly useful, doesn't use a whole lot of power, and it's secure enough. But there are security concerns about Bluetooth. Of course, Bluetooth is sending out information and it's receiving information, so it's extending the attack surface. This is one more thing that can be attacked and exploited. Now, the nice thing about Bluetooth is it has limited range. That sounds like a downside, but that also means that if somebody's going to be attacking you, they're going to be pretty close to you. So that helps to limit the amount of damage that can be done. Early Bluetooth standards didn't require encryption at all. They had encryption, it just wasn't required. So starting with version 2.1 and later, we see encryption required for all Bluetooth communications. Bluetooth is certainly vulnerable to a denial of service attack. It's really easy to do. You just get some device that sends out jamming signals on the right frequencies, and nobody's Bluetooth device will work. I don't know what the consequence to that is, and if your Bluetooth device suddenly started working, you could just look around. There'd be a guy pretty close to you running some kind of jammer, and you could tell him to knock it off. So it's not a major security concern, right? Bluetooth uses a process called pairing to authenticate devices and allow them to communicate. And generally, once two devices have been paired, you don't have to deal with it again. They'll connect automatically from that point forward. But when you buy a new mouse or a new headset, you have to pair it up first just to say, hey, I trust this device. I'm a good guy, not a bad guy. So go ahead and connect whenever you see this thing. Unfortunately, the pairing process is vulnerable to a lot of different attacks. Some vulnerabilities will allow devices to completely bypass the pairing and just connect to a device whenever. Other times it's automatic by design. They are trying to make things easier, but they allow any device to connect, and that's increasing the attack surface. Bluetooth can also be vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks. So during the pairing process, a third-party device might receive the incoming connections and establish a connection to the other device and continue forwarding all the communications, intercepting them, and allowing it to capture those communications for inspection or modify them in some way or another. But these are mitigated by the short range. You can see the guy who's intercepting your communications. Like, before you do some pairing, you should probably look around and make sure there's not some guy in a black hat and a trench coat who's going to try to intercept your headphone communications. I don't know why you do that. It's also slow, so you can't do too much with it. You couldn't upload some massive malware or steal all the files from somebody's computer across Bluetooth unless you had an extended exposure to that device. In other words, people passing me in traffic could, in theory, intercept some of the Bluetooth signals between my car and my phone, but they're probably not going to be there long enough to actually do any damage. Now let's talk about some real-world Bluetooth security compromises. In 2005, the Lasco worm could attack Symbian OS phones, and basically it would submit a file request to the Symbian phone, and the user would have to manually click to approve the file request, But if they did that, well, it would infect the phone with a worm, and then that phone would automatically begin trying to transmit the malware to other Symbian phones in the area. That's how a worm works. And it seems like requiring the user to approve it would have prevented it from ever spreading, but it actually spread pretty far, and people just kept approving it without knowing what the request was for. That happens. In that same year, some clever hacker developed a technique to eavesdrop on the pairing process and then use the information gathered during the eavesdrop to impersonate either of the two devices or just to eavesdrop on future communications. Now, this required somebody to build some custom hardware because generally Bluetooth hardware isn't what they call promiscuous. It can't listen for random connections that it's not participating in. But if you were clever enough to build some custom hardware and you happen to be present during the pairing process, then you could eavesdrop as long as you stayed within range. Now, that's why I said you should look around for a bad guy when you're going to do some pairing, but generally it's not that big of a concern. That 2005 was a year when Bluetooth was really kind of coming into its own, but it was still really early and we didn't really understand all of the security vulnerabilities, which is why so many of these attacks happened in that year. But that same year, in the UK at least, thieves started using Bluetooth to detect phones that people had left in their cars. So they could use this basically Bluetooth sensitive radio to tell them where active Bluetooth devices were. Then presumably they'd throw a brick through your window and steal it and sell it to make some money. Anyway, it just basically allowed them to more easily identify potential victims. That was easily solved either by turning off the Bluetooth or just keeping your phone with you. But it was an active Bluetooth exploit. 2007, we saw a pretty big one. You could actually root OS X via Bluetooth. Now, when I say root, I mean you take over administrative control over the operating system, and then you can do anything. You can install malware or look at all the files, and that all happened via Bluetooth. Now, of course, Apple released a patch just right away, so that exploit didn't stay around very long, but it's the kind of thing you can look for with Bluetooth or any new networking technology that comes around. And in 2007, somebody also released a Bluetooth pin cracker. Now, many different Bluetooth devices perform the pairing process by requiring you to type in a 4-digit pin often. So somebody just made kind of a brute force device that would guess a bunch of different pins until it actually got it. So you could kind of force the Bluetooth pairing process on another device as long as you could maintain communications with it, if you could stay within a few feet of it. And today there are just countless Bluetooth hacks for different devices. You can search around for them. I did a brief inventory of them, but most devices aren't vulnerable to any particular attack, but there are lots of different devices that can be hacked in different ways sometimes. Another short-range networking technology is RFID, radio frequency identifier. Basically, it's those little stickers that you see in like books, and there'll be little tags and clothes that you buy in stores. They're there for a couple of different reasons. For one, it provides inventory tracking for those devices. It also provides some anti-theft mechanism because they can detect it when you go to walk out the door with it. My dogs actually have little RFID tags in them, so if they get taken to the pound, well, they can just scan this little thing in their neck and it will provide a unique serial number, and then they can plug it into this national database that will tell them who owns the dog, basically. RFID works only over a short range that can only reach a few meters. And when you send out a pulse to them, when you communicate to the RFID tag, they respond with a serial number. There are basically 3 different types of transmissions. Now, of course, the one on my dog doesn't have a battery in it that's transmitting forever. It's not like I'm plugging my dog in and charging her, right? No, it's considered a passive RFID tag. Basically, they'll receive a signal from something and then kind of bounce it back, like they get a tiny bit of power from the signal and echo back something meaningful. There are RFID tags that actually have battery in them, and they can just transmit arbitrarily to communicate to devices that are listening around them. But that's not the way most RFID tags work. There are also RFID tags that are battery assisted passive. So these aren't just sending out wireless transmissions arbitrarily. They wait until they receive something, and then the battery will kick in and allow it to send out a stronger signal than a regular RFID signal. then the battery kicks in and allows it to respond with a stronger response than a traditional passive response. So let's talk about RFID security. Well, there's no authentication for most of these devices that just respond whenever you hit them. So that's why they're used for inventory. And I don't care if somebody hacks my dog. I mean, it's just got a tag on it that says their name anyway. So anybody can go and read my dog's serial number, and anybody can read the serial number that's in a book on the bookshelf. There's nothing secret about it. It's just identifying the book. It's no more, it doesn't require any more protection than the barcode on the back of the book, right? But different organizations use RFID for different things, and so some of these organizations might have security concerns around it. Some RFID tags can be spoofed. Certainly you could make an RFID tag that happened to respond with the same serial number as the one on my dog, and I guess somebody could pretend to be my dog. I guess that's not the most realistic scenario. But if you were moving inventory through a warehouse and you were trying to protect yourself from theft, well, a clever thief might steal a car or something with an RFID tag in it and set up a fake tag on something similar that couldn't be distinguished in the warehouse. The RFID tag would respond, spoofing the legitimate tag, and whoever was scanning it might think everything was still intact, when in reality it had been robbed. Some RFID tags are vulnerable to replay attacks. So in a replay attack, you just listen to whatever's being transmitted from the tag, capture it, and then you can replay it later. So my dog's tag certainly is. You could scan her tag and then capture the serial number that it popped out and then just broadcast that same serial number later, and you'd be impersonating my dog. That's not always true. Some RFID tags will use asymmetric cryptography, so they'll have a private key in there, and every response is signed with their private key, so you can validate the communications are genuine and therefore they're not vulnerable to replay attacks. And some types of RFID tags are just insecure in the way that they're designed. For example, in the UK, they were building RFID tags into passports. So you could get somebody's passport number by scanning it, and that could make things move along much faster in the airport, right? Well, some bad guys figured out that they could just scan the mail and read your passport number while it was sitting in a mail truck or in your mailbox. So that's bad because that was private information. And the way they solve that is now they ship it in a shielded container. Maybe there's like a little bit of lead in there that prevents the RFID tag from being scanned while it's being shipped. RFID tags are, of course, vulnerable to the elements. Heat them up too much, the connectors in them will melt together and short circuit and they won't work anymore. If you put them in a microwave, they'll pretty much always blow up. And I guess if you're a paranoid person and you don't want RFID tags, you could microwave them a little bit and that might fix things for you. But I don't recommend putting metal in a microwave. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.